Hello, and welcome to the Washington Monthly. I'm your host, Ann Kim.
And I'm your co-host, Garrett Epps.
In this episode, Trump's war on Maine and how Maine is winning.
Maine's motto is "We lead." So people will bring forward and say, okay, Maine didn't fold. Maybe we don't have to fold either.
Our guests are Luisa Deprez, Professor Emerita of Sociology and Social Policy at the University of Southern Maine, and Amy Freed, Professor Emerita of Political Science at the University of Maine. Their recent piece in the Washington Monthly describes the state's ongoing defiance of Donald Trump. Hi, Luisa. Hi, Amy. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Great to be here.
So we're going to start by playing the clip that started it all. So this was at an event at the White House back in February where Donald Trump tells the governor of Maine, your governor, Janet Mills, that she, quote, better comply with his executive order banning transgender athletes from women's sports.
NCAA has complied immediately, by the way. That's good. But I understand Maine. Is Maine here, the governor of Maine? Well, are you not going to comply with it?
I'm complying with state and federal laws.
We are the federal law. Well, you better do it. You better do it because you're not going to get any federal funding at all if you don't. And by the way, your population, even though it's somewhat liberal, although I did very well there, your population doesn't want men playing in women's sports. So you better comply because otherwise you're not getting any federal funding.
See you in court.
Every state, good. I'll see you in court. I look forward to that. That should be a real easy one.
So after Mills famously tells Trump, "We'll see you in court," what happens after that? What does the administration do to retaliate?
So let me just run through, and Amy, if you have any suggestions or any additions, but let me just run through what happened in the state of Maine. And just to put it in context, what I'm going to run through is essentially what happened in about a 6 or 7 week period. So it was just one thing after another. So after the February attack by Trump, the DOE launched a Title IX investigation, followed by DHHS initiating a compliance review, not with only the Maine Department of Education, but also with the university system. The USDA then notified the governor and the chancellor of the university that the next day they were putting $100 million of grants in jeopardy. The university it's a land grant system, so it does get money from the federal government. Right after that, the DOJ threatened the suit over the violation of Title IX. A week later, a $4.5 million Maine Sea Grant program was cut. And this was one of only 34 in the country. It was the only one that was cut. Then, as you may know, Social Security jumped in and required newborns to basically go into the Social Security office to get their Social Security numbers because the head of it was angry at the governor for being so rude to the president. The USDA then paused funding of about $30 million to the university system for research on PFASs, the toxic chemicals in farming, sustainable packaging, 4-H programs, and lobster fishing. Then the DOE found Maine's Department of Education in one school district of violating Title IX and added to that a FERPA violation, that parents' rights were being violated. Then the USDA froze funds for administrative and technological functions in schools, noting that, quote unquote, it was only the beginning. DOJ then terminated funding for the Maine Department of Corrections because a transgender woman was incarcerated in a women's prison. The DOJ then proceeded to pull all federal funding for K-12 education. On May 3rd, the administration agreed to restore federal funding for education and settled the lawsuit over the refreezing of nutrition programs by unfreezing the funding for those. And right now we have a December 3rd court date regarding the Department of Justice's suit against the state of Maine for violating transgender sports issues. So that was our 6 weeks.
So that sort of sounds like it's what we call
a Chinese tariff, right? Stuff came and went really fast, and I'm a little dizzy. What remains in place? What retaliation remains in place? And has this showed up in daily lives of Maine people yet?
So there was a lot of backtracking. So, for example, the Maine Sea Grant program got backtracked, mostly because the congressional delegation went in and begged to not have it done. I honestly don't know what's happening with the Maine Department of Corrections. I haven't seen anything on that. Amy, I don't know if you have. The nutrition programs for kids have gotten unfrozen. You know, the university's Sea Grant program has gotten reinstituted. But I think, what I would say is like many other organizations that are seeing this, there's been a reign of feeling of terror, of how are we going to continue to go on. You know, this is not a wealthy state. The average individual income in the state of Maine is about $40,000. So trying to make this up through increasing taxes would be nigh impossible. Amy?
Well, I'd also say that, Janet Mills, the governor of Maine, has really stood up in this case. And right after the USDA backtracked on May 3rd, the next, right after that, Governor Mills went out, had this press conference, and said, well, I said we'd see him in court. We did, we won. And then actually, probably the most striking line of the entire set of incidents, Governor Mills said that the letter that she had gotten from the USDA originally freezing the funds sounded like a ransom note written by a school child.
The other thing I would say is that it's really also up the ante on focus on trans people, because they're prior to the interaction between Mills and Trump, there were, I believe, about 8 anti-trans bills before the legislature. After that, the public hearing was held. There was 15 hours of public testimony on these bills, probably undoubtedly as a result of this getting so much news. The outcome was probably about 4-1 in opposition to the anti-trans bills that were there. And they basically covered the waterfront in terms of education, in terms of sports, in terms of violation of, not allowing Maine organizations who had any affiliation, whoever donated to an LGBTQ organization, from ever having any kind of federal funding. I mean, it was totally extreme. I don't know that would have happened as intensely had this issue not come up.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You mentioned a lot of it has been walked back at this point, and I'm curious about the details of the resistance. Governor Mills clearly did make good on her threat to see Trump in court, but I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about how the resistance kind of came together. Like, what was the strategy that was pursued, and how did average Mainers feel about this too?
I mean, I think it's complicated. My research as a political scientist, a lot of it had to do with public opinion. And this is a really sort of interesting case study because you have in polls 2/3 of Mainers say they don't approve of trans girls playing in girls' sports. But I just don't think it's a very salient issue. I mean, in the last governor's race, when Paul LePage challenged Governor Mills, her reelection, there were uses of trans issues by the LePage campaign. It was more about like how this had to do with children in elementary school, if they were getting like stories read to them that included gay families and trans characters and that sort of thing. But it certainly included those, not exactly the same, but included those issues. And that same year, the Maine Republican Party passed, certain planks in their party platform that had to do with kids and schools and hearing about LGBT people at all. And and the LePage campaign put money in that. They ran ads with that, and he lost, really in a landslide. It was about 13 points that he lost by. So I think, okay, that was a few years ago, but I think the same thing is true now, that even if you were to get a majority of people who say we don't like this particular thing, I don't think it's really important to that many voters. And then, today, in terms of these issues, there has been a very, very active LGBT rights set of groups and communities within the state of Maine for quite a long time. The first attempts to pass any kinds of laws that have to do with any kinds of rights, anti-discrimination, go back into the 1970s. In 2005, Maine had passed, the Maine legislature had passed for the third time. It had passed adding LGBTQ anti-discrimination provisions to the human rights code, along with race and sex, etc., religion. And it had passed it 3 times. Twice it was overturned by the people, but 2005, 10-point landslide to keep that law going. And then there were 2 votes on gay marriage, and the second one passed, several years before Obergefell. So, it's there, and there's just a tremendous amount of organization with all of that. Like just through I think in a way that there's a certain advantage to referenda, or there can be, because it gets people out there talking to people and gets a lot of people involved. And what Luisa talked about in terms of the large numbers of Mainers showing up to the state legislature, you can show up when there's a bill heard, wait, you get your 5 minutes, that's all. But, think of how many people that is if it's 15 hours worth of testimony. So, there was quite a reaction to it. And I think part of it, besides the issue itself, is that Mainers don't really want other people to tell us what to do. Like I'm not from Maine originally, but I've lived here long enough to know that, there's the feeling that you don't like outsiders coming in. Yeah, I don't know if you know this term, but in Maine, you're either from Maine or you're from away. And being from away, you could be from New Hampshire or you could be from Botswana. It doesn't really matter. You're just from away. And it's that whole like pushing against the people from away, trying to tell Mainers what to do, does pop up in a number of political campaigns.
The other thing I would say is that there was a new group protesting, and that was the farmers. So the farmers all moved into Augusta because they were angered by the USDA cutbacks, and not just for school lunch, but for the PFAs that were happening on their farms, for the loss of USDA staff members. So I think that, even going beyond, I mean, Amy and I have talked a lot about this, and, the trans issue for Trump is really symbolic. In many ways, it's like the anti-Semitic contentions against Harvard. He sort of finds an issue and then sort of has it explode. But the farmers were really upset, and they drove into town on their John Deere tractors. And many of the nonprofits, because they're so concerned about what's going on with sort of taking away the legitimacy of their taxes. So Maine, I think, has a history of people really coming together. I mean, when we have protests, they're really good protests. And this one was, legitimate. And we also had the governor who was basically standing out front. And I don't think for the most part, this was an issue that people were going to leave her alone, standing on the steps of the Capitol.
And that's where I think there might be broader lessons elsewhere,
Well, I got to admit that I'm curious about how this has affected electoral politics in Maine. You mentioned that LePage is
surfacing again, and people listening to this podcast may not know the splendor that is former Governor LePage. So you might want to talk about that. Trump says Maine is kind of liberal, but anyone who knows the state at all knows it's a lot more complicated than that. The state has one Republican and one independent senator. Kamala Harris carried the state. Um, what do you think is going on politically as a result of this? Is it pushing Maine into the blue column more?
Probably Amy could note that a little bit better than I could, but just to say is that the LePage, who professed himself to be Trump before Trump and then lost in a landslide to Janet when he came back for re-election, he actually has been living in Florida, and in April, this past April, registered to vote in Augusta. So he is a new voter register in the state of Maine for the purpose, and this is the statement that he put forward. He said, "We need people who will fight the extreme woke policies that defy common sense and force girls into unfair sports competitions. I am running to serve the people of Maine and help the president fix Washington."
Is there a flood of support?
Well, the Republicans are excited.
Well, some are and some aren't, though, because there are some people who are like, he came back. We thought he was going to be this big hope to defeat Janet Mills, and then he lost by 13 points, and then he moved back to Florida. He had when he ran against Janet Mills, he moved from Florida, back from Florida to then he went back to Florida, and now he's come back to run in the second district against Jared Golden, or at least for Jared Golden's seat. It's a little unclear what's going to happen if Golden may himself run for governor, or he might, if he stays in that race, for re-election, he is likely, now it looks like, to have a primary challenger, the former Secretary of State and current state auditor, Matt Dunlap. The second district is certainly the more conservative district, and Trump won it 3 times. And you can see, if you look at a number of different votes, that the first district and the second district have been diverging from themselves more and more. The first district is kind of Portland area. It's much smaller geographically because it's more dense area. And that is definitely a very liberal district, but represented by Shelley Pingree, who wins overwhelmingly.
Dang.
At the same time, the state is it's a very secular state, but at certain points, there have been highly organized groups based on more conservative religious perspectives. And in fact, the first marriage equality referendum, which overturned a law that the legislature had passed and the governor signed, enabling gay couples to get married. But that first campaign, which was in 2009, I believe, was led by the Portland diocese, the Catholic Church, and based in Portland. And there are evangelical Christians that are organized that sometimes really will have an impact on certain races, particularly some Republican primaries. So it's not like, there's an organization on the right. And the 2 districts are really very different. They've changed if you track them over time. In some ways, they've gotten more different. They used to vote together. We have this odd electoral college system like Nebraska, where you can divide the electoral votes. And they stay together every time until the first Trump election in 2016. And Trump carried that 3 times, has carried the second district 3 times, while the state of Maine in the first district, went for the Democrat. So, that's where LePage is running. LePage is planning on running in the second district against Jared Golden is the incumbent right now, the incumbent Democrat who's managed to squeak through despite being on the ballot at the same time Trump is. I think that when it comes to LePage and how people see him in the district, he did always win the second district every time that he ran. But in the race against Janet Mills, he only got 51% of the vote. So it was not an overwhelming, level of support. And it is possible there'll be somebody else in a primary against him, because some of the Maine Republicans are very happy to see him, but some of them are like, let's give somebody else a chance. You've been around for a long time. You didn't manage to beat Janet Mills, and now you hear him moving back from Florida a second time, as he did in the governor's race, to try to take take the spot in the campaign. And I think, like with any politicians, people made themselves want to be the ones to run, right? They that's why get the old timers in there when they can get a shot at it.
The other thing, when we look back on his, I can't remember, Amy, whether it was his first race or his second race. We had 3 people running for governor in each of those races. And essentially, the reason he won was because we also had a bear referendum at the same time. And so what you had was, and I don't think anybody's really looked at whether or not people were coming out in the Northern District and the Second District, particularly for LePage or for their rights to shoot bears. But there was
that vote had been in hibernation previously, I think.
Yes, it had been.
It's just unbearable to think about.
Yes, it did. Yes. So, yeah.
No, I mean, I think that did affect it. And, but the other thing is with the governor's race, you can win with a plurality vote. And he never won a majority when he ran for governor. The first time he was less than 40%. The second time he was actually fairly close to 50%, but still below. But right now we have ranked choice voting for congressional races. So he would need to ultimately get an outright majority, whether, on the initial vote or after some ranked choice tallies occur.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I want to ask about another huge election coming up in 2026, and that is Susan Collins, who is up for re-election. So outside of Maine, many Democrats admire her, like national Democrats, because she has been one of the few Republican senators willing to stand up to Trump. She voted in favor of his impeachment after the January 6th insurrection, for instance. And she actually voted against Pete Hegseth, who is possibly the worst defense secretary we have ever had. But she may be terribly vulnerable this time around. Can you guys dissect that race and what are her odds?
Well, I'll let Amy take that, but let's not forget that she also voted for Kavanaugh, really believing that, in fact, he was going to protect any precedents that were, in fact, there.
Well, I personally don't believe that she believed that. I think she knew that it was at least a huge risk but that's like its own podcast by itself. How do we understand Susan Collins? I don't know. In some ways, I'd say nobody nationally should feel, secure that Susan Collins can be beaten because she has been a survivor. And there was, so much money in the last race that certainly Sarah Gideon was very well funded, but she came up short. But on the other hand, I think her trajectory has been down. I mean, the last time she ran, she got 51% of the vote. A lot of people nationally say, oh, she beat Sarah Gideon by, whatever it was, 8 or 9 points. It was a huge win. I think in a ranked choice race, that's the wrong way to think about it. There was a Green Party candidate who took a number of votes. And I'm quite sure, just from informal conversations, maybe it's just anecdotal, that a lot of those voters ranked Lisa Savage, the Green Party candidate, first, and then ranked Sarah Gideon second. So if Collins had been a little bit below 50%, she very well could have lost the race, even if she had a plurality. And when she got 51% of the vote, that was a huge drop from the time before when she got almost 69% of the vote. And she very consistently, all of her races for the Senate were either in the 60%, somewhere in that range, or very high 50% range. So she, has done, well over the years and has been has been declining. Also, 2020, there were no canvassers on the Democratic side because it was in the middle of the pandemic. That probably had some impact, and it was before Dobbs. So Collins went out in the debates, and when challenged about her Kavanaugh vote, said, "Oh, I think that there will, there's no reason to assume that Roe isn't going to survive." And since it hadn't happened yet, you could, that kind of reduced the effectiveness of that. And she's in a position where a lot of Republicans in Maine don't think she's pro-Trump enough. There was a PPP poll on this, but then a lot of Democrats think she's too Trumpy. So, she loses on both sides. On the other hand, I do think ultimately Maine Republicans are going to vote for her if she's the nominee, because we have to stop whoever this other person is against them. So even though they don't like her that much, and I think that's been for a while, most Maine Republicans probably do think she's too much of a squish. They're probably going to end up voting for her. Which is why I think she might end up doing fine. I think within Maine, a lot of observers think that Collins will only go so far when it comes to Trump. And yeah, she voted against Hegseth, but she voted for RFK Jr. She voted for basically everybody. And there was a lot of organizing around at least RFK Jr. from the Maine medical community, and people had meetings with her. There were things in the paper, and she ignored that. And I think she knew better. I really do. I think she's smart enough and savvy enough to know what he was going to do. But then she will play around with making a comment or even taking a vote. What a lot of people believe in Maine is that Collins will never take a vote against Republicans if it is going to be the deciding vote. She will never, ever do that. And really, the only time I can think of where that was not true was ACA repeal, because it was a one vote margin, but that was only because John McCain walked in the middle of the night and surprised everyone by voting no. If he had gone the other way, then again, she would have voted no, gotten credit for being standing up for health care for Mainers and against Trump, but her vote wouldn't have made any difference at all. I'd also just add that one of the pillars of a Susan Collins campaign is saying that she's the one who's going to bring home the bacon, and that she has all this ability to bring money to Maine. She will go to places all the time during the campaign. Here's a community center that was built from a grant that I helped secure, whatever it is. So she gets, that kind of very local coverage and state coverage. And she said in her last race that she thought she would rise to be, the head of the chair of the Senate Appropriations Committee, which she has, and she'll be able to do a lot of good things for Maine. But, and she is definitely she gets a certain amount of credit whenever we go back to this whole situation now, when some of the funding gets reversed. So people say, well, it's because of Susan Collins that the Sea Grant funding got restored. And it just sometimes seems a little bit too convenient. Remove the money, then Susan Collins gets to claim some credit for it. While at the same time, she also voted, for the OMB director, Russell Vought, who's, been, he's like, responsible in some ways for just saying president can do anything when it comes to funds.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of it will depend on how much credit Mainers will really give her for, restoring funds at particular times versus just, putting that aside and saying she could be even stronger as a leader. There is definitely still a section of voters, and even Democratic voters, who are like, they like someone who seems bipartisan and centrist. And there's something I call Margaret Chase Smith brain in Maine. Like, Margaret Chase Smith was, a senator for Maine, who is just absolutely heralded in Maine for, quote, standing up to Joe McCarthy by giving a speech that made absolutely no difference. Like, it really did nothing to limit McCarthy. But like up in Bangor where I live, if you walk into the federal building, it's the Margaret Chase Smith Federal Building. There's Margaret Chase Smith, you can see her face, and then, a quote from her Declaration of Conscience speech. So people get a lot of credit for things that they say, and I think that she's got to be judged, and whoever her opponent is has to like sort of cause her to be more judged on things that she does.
Well, here's when we look back on this in 5 years, are we going to say this outcome was good, that something good came out of this, or is it just an ugly chapter?
I think it's just an ugly chapter. And I think we're going to look back on everything that's happening as an ugly chapter. One of the ironies for me about this is just the hypocrisy. That the DOE is being eliminated so that the states can get federal money. And so we go to states' rights. But when a state like Maine declares its rights around trans, then the federal government comes in and abolishes or wants to abolish states' rights. So the hypocrisy, the going back and forth, and the symbolism of utilizing particular issues to, in fact, evoke fear from voters, to pick on issues that are high-ranking issues. And, they've done that with the universities and anti-Semitism. I mean, even the Jewish community is coming out completely and utterly disgusted at how the Trump administration is using anti-Semitism to, in fact, evoke, support for what he's doing. Did the same thing in trans. I honestly don't know what the issue of trans in Maine has a relationship to a U.S. Sea Grant. It's hard to figure out where these things are school lunches for kids. It would have made more sense if the USDA would have come in and said, any kid who's trans or LGBTQ can't eat. But they didn't do that. It was just blanket. It's these blanket coverings that, in fact, is, it's just, if there's anything that I guess states, and Amy and I were talking a little bit earlier or yesterday about what can we tell states about this? I think we came to the conclusion is that you can fight this, laying down and just succumbing and saying, okay, Trump, you can get whatever you want because you've now scared us enough. Is not what's going to help states or institutions or organizations to basically sustain the work that they're doing and the work that they're trying to do on behalf of the people that they serve. I think this is probably the feistiest I've ever seen Janet Mills. I lived in the state for 50 years. I've only been gone for 2. And she has been a presence. She was, Attorney General before that. And she comes from a feisty family. But this has been the feistiest I've ever seen her come out in regard to this in terms of protecting the citizens of the state. And so I'm hoping that other states or other organizations will not, in fact, succumb, will not roll over. I think the fear that he is imposing is real, and his abilities to do that are real. But, and if you don't have somebody like Susan Collins or Janet Mills to come back and basically get the funds back again. But I'm also hoping that more people will begin to point out the hypocrisy of what it is that they are in fact doing. States' rights okay for one thing. If they agree with them, states' rights not okay if they don't agree with them. I'd like to say it makes no sense, but I don't know anything in this administration right now that's making very much sense. You don't take things out of the African American Museum because they're duplicates. You just don't do that.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely an ugly chapter, and it's part and parcel of what Trump's doing and othering in general, whether it's immigrants or trans people. But I do think it shows you can fight back and you can win. And Trump's been losing in court a lot. And the state of Maine has been, right there, whether it's these cases that are individually against Maine or as part of larger, state groups, state attorneys general who are fighting against what the Trump administration is doing.
I mean, Harvard in many ways has gotten lots of credit for not succumbing like Columbia did. And I think that I'm hoping that part of the legacy that we'll pass on is that people will, and Maine's motto is "We lead." So people will bring forward and say, okay, Maine didn't fold. Maybe we don't have to fold either. And so I think that there is strength in terms of creating a model for how it in fact can be done.
So maybe we could say that President Alan Garber of Harvard is the Janet Mills of education, right?
Not a bad comparison. I mean, I think they have a little bit more money in their endowment than we have in their state government.
Yeah.
Maine is also, we're a small state. We have 1.4 million people. So yes, I think that that's a great comparison, Garrett. I appreciate that. We'll pass that on to her.
Maine punches above its weight.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, thank you, Luisa, and thank you, Amy. It's so great to have you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Great to be here.
It's been great fun.
That's it for this week from the Washington Monthly. I'm Ann Kim, and on behalf of my co-host, Garrett Epps, thank you for listening. If you like what you heard, don't forget to subscribe to our channel or wherever you get your podcasts. Have a wonderful week.